Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to take a look at the macro-historical framework from Carroll Quigley's massive study of human societies. We really want to understand exactly how our modern world came to be so intensely complex. Because, if you've ever wondered why civilizations rise, fall, or just suddenly shift their entire worldview, well, you are definitely in the right place. Today we're literally mapping out the machinery of history.
So let's just dive right into our source text. It's this dense, totally fascinating book called Tragedy and Hope. And what it does is it relies on identifying the universal patterns and mechanics of human history over millennia. Rather than just giving us a dry list of dates and battles, which, let's be honest, we've all had enough of, the author gives us this incredibly wide lens to observe how societies actually function as massive, interconnected systems.
And we begin with a pretty huge, existential question that the source poses right at the start. It basically challenges us to consider, are we destined to repeat the cyclical death of past empires? I mean, out of about 20 civilizations that have existed in human history, over a dozen are already dead. They simply vanished. Like the Romans, the Incas, gone. So the big question is, are we next? To answer that, we really have to look at the structural life cycle of how a civilization actually operates.
Okay, to avoid getting lost in all the details, we'll use this macro lens to break down the author's theory into four distinct puzzle pieces: the life cycles of civilizations, the dynamics of cultural diffusion, the resulting demographic explosion, and finally, the shattering of 19th century optimism.
Let's start with part one, the life cycles of civilizations, or the organism of history. The text proposes this really cool idea that civilizations act a whole lot like living organisms. They're born, they expand, they stagnate, and eventually they die.
There's a clear evolutionary cycle at play here. First, a society experiences a vigorous age of expansion, growing in population, geographic area, production, knowledge, the whole shebang. But eventually, that expansion slows down. The vested interests in the system basically petrify, and that triggers the age of conflict, which is exactly what it sounds like. Class struggles, imperialist wars, growing irrationality. Usually, out of that chaos, one state conquers the rest to create a universal empire. This brings a golden age of peace for a bit, sure, but it ultimately leads right into an age of decay and destruction by outside invaders.
Now, there is a really stark contrast between those dead civilizations and Western civilization's totally unique ability to reorganize its own structure. Think about the Mesopotamian, classical, and Andean civilizations. They all hit their age of conflict, became universal empires under the Assyrians, the Romans, and the Incas, and then they were destroyed. But Western civilization has been different. It somehow bypassed that universal empire stage multiple times. Instead of just permanently decaying during its ages of conflict, it reformed itself. It moved from the feudal system to commercial capitalism and then on to industrial capitalism. And doing that allowed for entirely new periods of expansion.
Which brings us to part two, the dynamics of cultural diffusion, looking at the core versus the periphery. This is all about how civilizations interact with each other and how culture diffuses outward. So when a civilization expands, its culture spreads, right? But there's a vital, absolutely crucial distinction in how different parts of that culture travel. The material elements, we're talking physical tools, weapons, basic technologies, those move incredibly fast. They spread like wildfire. But the non-material elements, the scientific outlook, the religious heritage, the deep ideas of individual rights that give a society its spiritual cohesion, those move very, very slowly, if they even move at all.
And this is where things get messy. When Western civilization exported its technologies globally, things like firearms, sanitation, agriculture, transportation, they often arrived in peripheral societies in a completely different order than they did in Europe. And this profoundly disrupted those native cultures. See, in Europe, the agricultural revolution happened first, providing the massive amount of food needed to support the later industrial and medical revolutions. But in places like Asia, Western transportation and medical sanitation arrived before the agricultural advances. You can imagine the absolute chaos this causes, right? A society suddenly has the modern ability to preserve life, but hasn't yet developed the agriculture to actually feed all those saved lives.
And that mismatch leads directly into part three, the demographic explosion, which acts as this massive biological engine for geopolitics.
To understand this pressure, we have to look at the demographic cycle. In stage A, primitive societies have high birth rates balanced out by high death rates, meaning the overall population stays pretty stable. But introduce modern medicine, and suddenly the death rate plummets while the birth rate stays super high. That is stage B, the demographic explosion. Eventually, you hit stage C, where the birth rate falls, and finally stage D, where the population ages and starts to decline. Western Europe went through this cycle naturally over centuries, which gave them plenty of time to adapt. But when modern medicine was exported globally, it hit peripheral societies basically all at once.
To put that into perspective, just look at this staggering statistic. By the mid-20th century, India's population was shooting up by 5 million people every single year. Because they got Western medicine and sanitation before they had an agricultural revolution to feed everyone, millions of people were saved from disease only to face intense poverty and starvation. This out-of-order cultural diffusion created unimaginable social and political pressures.
And as this population explosion rippled outward geographically, it created massive geopolitical friction. It's like a wave. What started as Anglo-French pressure around 1850 morphed into Central European pressure by 1900, as the demographic boom reached Germanic and Italian populations. By 1950, the explosion had hit Eastern Europe, resulting in heavy Slavic and Soviet pressure. And projecting out to the year 2000, the source points to massive Asiatic pressure. Honestly, this simple cyclical demographic wave explains so much of the global conflict we've witnessed over the last 2 centuries.
All right, let's move to part 4, the shattering of optimism and the 20th century shift. We need to see how all these massive historical gears crash together to alter our very ideology.
So, the 19th century was defined by this incredibly optimistic mindset. It was an era of profound, almost naive hope, deeply rooted in the belief of inevitable progress. People genuinely believed that human nature was innately good and that any evil out there was just the result of bad social institutions. They believed in a sort of community of interests, this idea that if everyone just pursued their own selfish goals, society as a whole would automatically progress. It relied really heavily on secularism and laissez-faire capitalism.
But then reality hit. The trauma of the World Wars and the Global Depression acted as a completely shattering blow to that pretty 19th century dream world. The sheer scale of violence and destruction in the early 20th century was just totally incompatible with the belief in automatic, peaceful progress. I mean, at first, people tried to treat the First World War as a temporary aberration. In the 1920s, they pretended they could just go back to the way things were. But the Great Depression and the terrifying rise of totalitarianism, that tore the facade away forever.
And this caused a fundamental ground-up shift. The 20th century learned the hard way that humanity, if left completely unchecked, can easily fall right back to the law of the jungle. Evil was no longer seen as just some absence of good. It was recognized as a highly active, positive, destructive force. And as a result, those old ideas of unchecked individualism began to be rapidly replaced by demands for strict social discipline, state planning, and a much more pessimistic, sometimes even irrational worldview, just to contain that human capacity for destruction.
So, stepping back, we can see how technology, population, and economic pressures mechanically drive the rise and fall of civilizations. It's all connected in this massive, breathing organism we call history. And the real beauty of understanding Quigley's macro lens framework is that it allows us to observe these historical mechanics impartially, without taking any ideological sides. We can actually trace how the demographic cycle and out-of-order cultural diffusion don't just shift borders on a map, they fundamentally shift the very way we think about human nature itself.
Which leads us to examine our modern context with one final, lingering thought. Are we currently heading towards an inevitable universal empire and eventual decay? Or are we on the brink of another great reorganization? We've seen Western civilization bypass the final stages of decay before by adapting and restructuring its core systems. The question now is, in the face of our current immense global pressures, will we find a way to spark a fourth age of expansion? Or will we just follow the path of the Romans? I'll leave you to think about that. Thanks for joining.